Welcome to the Word Room. We are going from Genesis to Revelation through every chapter of the Bible, breaking down a summary of the chapter, some key takeaways, and what it tells us about God. Today we're on Genesis chapter 12, which is a shifting point of the entire Bible, really in the book of Genesis, but also the entire Bible, because this shifts us from talking about the creation of man and kind of man's downfall to now talking about God's plan of redemption for the nations. So you don't want to miss it. Stick around to the end to find out what this chapter tells us about God. Let's go. All right. So let's jump right into our summary of Genesis chapter 12. So first of all, we see here that God told Abram, "Go, I will make you a great nation and you're going to be a blessing." We'll look at the specific promises he makes him in this chapter in just a moment. But God tells him to go, that he's going to leave Ur of the Chaldees and he's going to go. So Abram then left Ur of the Chaldees. He took his wife, his father, and his nephew, and they all left Ur of the Chaldees, which is where this command was given. Reading this chapter, it makes it sound like it was given in Haran, but it was not. So if you go read and watch the last chapter in Genesis chapter 11, we talked about that, how in the book of Acts it clearly says it was given in Ur. They leave Ur of the Chaldees. However, they make it to Haran, where they end up staying for a long time. So they end up settling in Haran instead of going to Canaan, which is where God told them to go. It's the land that he told them to go to. They end up staying in Haran until Abram's father passes away. Then sometime after that, they leave Haran. So Abram, Sarai, and Lot leave Haran and go to the land of Canaan. And while there, God promises Abram's seed the land of Canaan. So he says, "I'll give this land to your seed." So Abram builds an altar there and worships God in Canaan. However, he ends up leaving Canaan due to a famine that hits and ends up going down to Egypt. So he leaves the land of Israel, Canaan being the land of Israel. He ends up leaving that and going down to Egypt to try to survive the famine. In Egypt, Abram lied about Sarai being his wife, causing the Pharaoh there to take her as a wife. But Pharaoh was cursed as a result of taking Abram's wife. We'll look at that in just a moment. So some key takeaways from this chapter. First, God promised the impossible and asked Abram to believe it. Sarah was already described as barren. So God promised, "I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give this land to your seed." Well, his wife is barren, and it was already described that she was barren. So if she's barren, how's this going to happen? It's impossible. And so it's very, very important to understand that when God made this promise to Abram, it was impossible, and he was asked to believe it anyway. Keep that in mind. We'll get more in depth as God continues to speak to Abram throughout the coming chapters on this promise and kind of Abram's response to it. But God promised, "You're going to have seed. I'm going to make you a great nation, and they're going to have this land." So that's kind of what the promises are. It consisted of God promising that he was going to make him a great nation, that he was going to make Abram's name great, that he would make Abram a blessing to those in the earth, and promised that he would have seed and that seed would be given the land of Canaan. So very important promises from God to Abram. God did not promise Abram would possess Canaan, but that his seed would. That's important. The promise was not that Abram would be given the land of Canaan. It's that his seed, his children and their children would ultimately get the land of Canaan. Abram would never be actually able to dwell in Canaan. He could potentially live there, but he couldn't. It wouldn't become his land. It would still be the land of the Canaanites. Also, they went to Egypt because of famine, versus came to Egypt because Sarai was taken as a wife forcibly by Pharaoh. Now, the reason I know it's forcibly, she's married to Abraham. She's not going to willingly go be Pharaoh's wife. So Pharaoh took her forcibly as a wife. Now, this is important because it's foreshadowing. This actually foreshadows Israel going to Egypt in famine in Joseph's story at the end of this book, leading into the Exodus. where in the Exodus, plagues come on Egypt due to the Israelites being taken as slaves forcibly. It's literally a foreshadowing of that event happening. But Abram lied about Sarai not being his wife. He said, she's my sister, because he was afraid that if he said she was beautiful, Sarai was beautiful, and if the Pharaoh wanted her and he said that it was his wife, he was afraid they would kill Abram and then just take Sarah anyways. So he lied, hoping to avoid being killed by Pharaoh. Also, Abram's lie here was selfish and faithless. I think that's interesting. Abram was the father of faith. Yet we see here, God promised him a seed. God promised that he's going to make him a great nation. God promised that he was going to give him his seed, the land of Canaan. None of that's happened yet. So obviously, God's faithful to his promise. That's going to happen. And yet he didn't trust that God could keep him from being killed in Egypt. He didn't trust that if he was just honest and said that Sarai was his wife, that God couldn't protect him and make sure that he stayed safe and didn't die before that promise happened. If God made the promise, he's going to make it sure the promise comes to pass. But Abram lied because he didn't have faith enough to believe God could protect him. And yet here's Abram, the father of our faith. Again, just highlighting the fact that while God calls us, he doesn't call perfect people. And not you'll see it over and over throughout as we go through these chapters. God calls someone, they fail. It's just the constant theme because man is sinful. Also, Abram believed God while wrestling with unbelief. We can clearly see here he didn't believe God could keep him safe, but he believed God enough to go to Canaan in the first place. It's like this back and forth wrestling. It reminds me of the New Testament. There's a healing that Jesus does, and he says, the person says, God, I believe, or Jesus, I believe, help my unbelief. I believe, but help my unbelief. In other words, I believe you, but I'm also wrestling with this unbelief. God understands that. And that's what's incredible about God. He's good. He understands that you struggle with questions and unbelief, and that's okay. He still chooses to use imperfect people, which is awesome. So this tells us 5 things about God. First, he calls the imperfect. He doesn't call the perfect people. He calls people who are imperfect. He understands that you are not perfect, and he calls you anyways. He reaches out to you anyways. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He calls the imperfect. 2, he makes promises. He's a God of promises, and he will always bring about his promises. He is faithful to his word. So he is a God who makes promises. He's also a God that can do the impossible. He promised that Sarai, who is barren, will have a child, that there will be seed that is made that will become a great nation that will be given the land of Canaan. He can do the impossible. He shows mercy in failure, which is very, very important. Abram failed and he showed mercy. And we also see that he reveals the future, that the future of Canaan being given to Abram's seed. He is a God who knows the future, but not just knows it, he reveals it to his people. Very, very important. 5 things that we learned about God. I hope you go study this chapter, seek God, see what you encounter with God. Comment down below how this chapter has impacted you or what you saw in this chapter. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. We'll see you next time.